Title: The bubble tea shop owner remembered my order after just one visit, and my whole life changed. She looked at me and said my name before I ever gave it. I froze at the counter, cup halfway to my lips. Brown sugar oat milk. Extra boba. Light ice, she said. I had only been here once. Months ago. How do you remember that? I whispered. She smiled like she was keeping a secret just for me. 3 weeks later, I found out why she remembered, and it broke my heart before it ever healed it. My name is Maya Coleman, 29 years old, living in Portland, Oregon, working long hours as a graphic designer who barely had time for love. I never expected a small tea shop on a rainy corner to become the place where my entire life quietly rearranged itself. The shop was called Moonleaf Tea, tucked between a laundromat and a used bookstore. Easy to miss unless you were looking for warmth on a cold afternoon. I had wandered in only once before, soaked from the rain, ordering without thinking, desperate for something hot to hold in my hands. That first visit lasted 11 minutes. Just enough time to notice her eyes, steady and dark. And then I left without saying much else. I told myself I would never go back. That Portland had 100 other tea shops. That this meant nothing at all. 3 months passed before circumstances pulled me back down that same rainy street, past the laundromat, toward that same glowing green sign. I told myself it was only for the tea. That convenience alone explained why my feet turned that direction again. When she recited my exact order without me speaking a word, something inside my chest tilted sideways, unfamiliar and impossible to ignore. I'm Sophie, she said, sliding the cup toward me. And you looked like you needed someone to remember you today. I laughed nervously, unsure whether she meant it as flirtation or simple kindness, unsure which answer I was hoping for. Over the following weeks, I found reasons to walk past Moonleaf Tea, inventing errands that always somehow ended near her door. Sophie began saving the seat by the window for me, setting a small folded napkin there like a quiet invitation. We talked about nothing important at first. Weather, music, the terrible parking on her block, easy conversation that never felt easy before. I noticed how she remembered small details from every visit. My sister's name, my fear of thunderstorms, the podcast I mentioned once. Nobody had paid attention to me like that in years, and it frightened me how quickly I wanted more of it. One evening she stayed 40 minutes past closing just to finish a conversation about my mother, refusing to rush me out the door. By early spring, our conversations had turned into something neither of us named out loud but both of us protected carefully. Sophie began texting me good morning. Small unremarkable messages that somehow reorganized the shape of my entire day around them. I started designing flyers for her shop for free, staying late at my apartment just to see her face light up the next morning. My best friend Renee noticed the change first, teasing that I smiled at my phone like a teenager reading a love note. I denied it loudly, then immediately opened our messages again the moment Renee looked away, smiling exactly like she described. Sophie invited me to help her choose new tea flavors, letting me taste test recipes in the quiet kitchen after the shop closed. Standing shoulder to shoulder over steaming pots, our hands brushed twice, and neither of us pulled away the second time. I like having you here, she said quietly, not looking up from the counter, voice careful like she was testing solid ground. I like being here, I answered, and the silence after felt louder than anything either of us had said all night. That was the night she finally asked me to stay for dinner upstairs, in the small apartment above the shop she called home. We ate noodles from mismatched bowls, laughing about nothing, and somewhere between the second bowl and the third, she took my hand. I've wanted to do that since the day you walked in soaking wet, she admitted, cheeks flushed from more than the steam. I kissed her before she could second-guess herself, and for one whole minute, my anxious mind finally stopped calculating everything. We didn't define it that night, but something shifted permanently, quiet and certain, like a door finally clicking shut behind us. Walking home afterward, I realized I hadn't felt this kind of hope in years. And it scared me almost as much as it thrilled me. Spring turned into something warmer between us. Weekend mornings spent wandering farmers' markets. Evenings spent curled together watching bad reality television. Sophie taught me to make dumplings from her grandmother's recipe. Flour dusted across both our hands, laughter filling her tiny kitchen. I introduced her to Renee, who approved instantly, later telling me privately that she'd never seen me this relaxed around anyone. We started calling each other every night before bed. Small rituals forming without either of us planning them out loud. Sophie kept a small notebook behind the counter, and one day I caught a page filled with notes about my preferences. "You wrote down my order the very first day," I said. "Done." Flipping through pages dated back to that rainy afternoon. "I wanted an excuse to remember you," she admitted, embarrassed, closing the notebook gently like it held something fragile. That confession settled something in me. Proof that this connection wasn't accidental, that she had chosen me deliberately from the beginning. We began spending nearly every free evening together, my apartment and hers blending into one shared, comfortable rhythm. I started leaving a toothbrush at her place, a small unspoken milestone neither of us mentioned but both of us noticed. Sophie's employees teased her about smiling more at work, joking that business had improved since I started visiting daily. It felt, for the first time in years, like my life finally had a center that didn't revolve around exhaustion or loneliness. One quiet Tuesday, she told me she loved me while we washed dishes, so casually it took me a second to register. I dropped the towel, turned around, and set it back before I could talk myself into hesitation or fear. We stood there laughing, soap bubbles on our hands, feeling like the luckiest two people in the entire city of Portland. For a while, everything felt uncomplicated, like we had found a rare pocket of the world untouched by outside judgment. That peace, I would soon learn, was only temporary, resting quietly on top of things neither of us had said yet. My mother called one Sunday, asking why I hadn't visited in weeks, her voice carrying that familiar edge of quiet disappointment. I hesitated on the phone, unsure how to explain where my time had gone without revealing the truth I wasn't ready to share. "I've just been busy with work," I lied, glancing at Sophie across the room, who pretended not to notice my discomfort. My mother had always assumed I would eventually settle down with a man, a belief she repeated at every family gathering. I had avoided the conversation for years, letting silence stand in for an answer I was too afraid to give directly. Sophie never pushed me about coming out, but I could see the quiet hurt whenever I introduced her as my friend. "I understand you're not ready," she said one night, "but I need to know there's an endpoint to waiting." Her words stayed with me for days, a gentle deadline I hadn't realized I was running toward without noticing. At the same time, Sophie's own family situation was more complicated than I initially understood, something she avoided discussing directly. I noticed a photo behind her register of a young man, always assuming he was simply an old friend from childhood. One afternoon her mother visited unexpectedly, and Sophie introduced me quickly as my business partner, voice tight with panic. I forced a smile through the visit, but the word partner landed heavier than she probably intended, echoing long after her mother left. "I'm sorry," Sophie said afterward, holding my hands. "My parents still think I'm engaged to David, my best friend from college." My stomach dropped, confusion and hurt colliding as I asked her to explain exactly what she meant by engaged. She explained that David, gay himself, had agreed years ago to pose as her fiancé to protect them both from their families. It was an old arrangement, she insisted, one she'd been meaning to end but never found the courage to unravel. I understood the fear behind it, yet something inside me still ached, wondering where I actually stood in her life. "You have a photo of him behind your counter," I said quietly, "and you've never once mentioned mine to your parents." She had no easy answer, and the silence between us that night felt colder than any Portland rainstorm. We didn't speak for 3 days after that conversation, both of us needing space to sit with what had surfaced. Renee reminded me that fear doesn't erase love. That Sophie's silence came from years of protecting herself, not from betrayal. Doubt crept in, whispering that maybe I was only ever going to be her secret, never her declared truth. On the fourth day, Sophie showed up at my apartment holding 2 cups of tea, eyes red from crying earlier that morning. "I told David the engagement is over," she said before I could speak, voice trembling but certain. She explained she had finally called her parents, not fully coming out yet, but ending the fake arrangement that had trapped her. It wasn't everything, but it was movement. A crack of honesty in a wall she built for years out of necessity. I forgave her that night, understanding that courage often arrives in small, imperfect steps rather than one dramatic confession. We promised each other honesty moving forward, agreeing to face our family's expectations together instead of separately in silence. For a while, that promise held steady, giving us both a fragile but real sense of forward momentum. Then my mother announced she was visiting Portland for my birthday, insisting on meeting my roommate Sophie in person. Panic set in immediately, knowing my mother's visit would force a conversation I had postponed for far too long. Sophie offered to disappear for the weekend, to protect me from confrontation, but something in me refused to let her. "No," I said firmly, surprising even myself. "I want you there. I'm done hiding what matters most to me." That decision felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, terrifying and strangely liberating at the exact same moment. My mother arrived on a Friday evening, suitcase in hand, immediately filling my apartment with familiar warmth and familiar pressure. Sophie joined us for dinner, nervous energy barely hidden beneath polite smiles and careful, measured conversation. Halfway through the meal, my mother asked when I planned to settle down properly, her usual coded question about marriage. I felt Sophie's hand find mine beneath the table, steady and warm, grounding me before I even opened my mouth. "Mom," I said, voice shaking. "Sophie isn't my roommate. She's my girlfriend. And I love her." The silence that followed stretched painfully long, my mother's fork frozen halfway between her plate and her lips. "I need a moment," she finally said, standing abruptly, walking toward the balcony without looking at either of us. I followed her outside, heart pounding, bracing myself for anger, rejection, or worse, complete and total silence. Instead, she stood staring at the city lights, tears in her eyes, saying nothing for what felt like forever. "I always suspected," she finally whispered. "I just wasn't ready to hear it out loud from you." It wasn't full acceptance. Not yet. But it wasn't rejection either. And that uncertain middle ground felt like enough for now. She left 3 days later without fully resolving things. But she hugged Sophie goodbye. A small gesture that meant everything. Weeks passed with cautious optimism. My mother texting occasionally, slowly warming despite her own internal struggle with what I'd shared. Sophie's shop began thriving that summer. Word spreading about her recipes, lines forming out the door on weekend mornings. We started dreaming aloud about the future, half-jokingly discussing opening a second location together, blending my design skills with her business. Life felt, for the first time in years, like it was finally moving in a direction I had chosen freely. Then, without warning, everything shifted again, starting with a phone call from Sophie's landlord about unpaid rent on the building. Sophie confessed she had been quietly struggling financially for months, ashamed to admit it, afraid it would change how I saw her. "Why didn't you tell me?" asked, hurt not by the debt itself, but by the secrecy surrounding it. "Because you already carry so much for me," she said. I didn't want to be one more burden. I reminded her that partnership meant sharing burdens, not hiding them. And slowly she began opening up about the numbers. Together we reworked her budget late into the night, cutting costs, renegotiating suppliers, refusing to let the shop slip away quietly. At the same time, an old rumor resurfaced at my workplace. Someone had seen Sophie and me together downtown, holding hands. A coworker named Trevor began making pointed comments in meetings, testing whether I would confirm or deny what he'd apparently seen. I tried to ignore it, focusing on work. But tension in the office grew heavier with each passing week. One afternoon, Trevor outed me loudly in the break room, framing it as a joke that landed like a public accusation. The room went silent, colleagues exchanging awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh, defend me, or simply look away entirely. I left early that day, humiliated and furious, replaying the moment over and over on my drive home to Sophie's apartment. "I'm so sorry," she said, holding me while I cried. "You shouldn't have had to face that alone." My manager, thankfully, took the incident seriously, issuing a formal warning to Trevor after I reported what happened. Though something had cracked. A reminder that acceptance at home didn't guarantee safety everywhere else in my life. Sophie, meanwhile, grew quieter about her own financial stress, insisting she had everything under control despite obvious signs otherwise. I later discovered she'd taken a second small loan without telling me, terrified of admitting how close the shop was to closing. When I found the paperwork by accident, hurt flared again. Another instance of her protecting me instead of trusting me fully. "You promised honesty," I reminded her, voice tight. "And instead I keep finding things out on my own." She broke down then. Admitting years of self-reliance had taught her that needing help meant becoming a burden to someone else. I held her through the tears, realizing her secrecy wasn't about distrust, but about old wounds neither of us had fully addressed. We agreed, again, to try harder, promising weekly check-ins about money, work, and anything else weighing silently on either of us. Felt fragile, like rebuilding something delicate after a small earthquake, but we were both willing to keep trying anyway. Just as things steadied again, my mother called with unexpected news, her voice unusually shaky on the other end of the line. "Your grandmother's heart isn't doing well," she said. "The whole family is gathering in Ohio this weekend." I booked a flight immediately, torn between grief and anxiety about seeing extended family who didn't yet know about Sophie. Sophie offered to stay behind, not wanting to complicate an already painful family moment during a medical emergency. But my mother, surprising me completely, insisted Sophie come too, saying quietly, "Family should be there together." That single sentence meant more to me than any grand declaration could have. Proof of how far she'd traveled internally. We flew to Ohio together, nervous but united, walking into a hospital waiting room filled with relatives I hadn't seen in years. My aunt raised an eyebrow at Sophie's presence, whispering questions my mother firmly and calmly answered without hesitation. "This is Maya's girlfriend, Sophie," she said plainly, silencing the whispers with a steadiness I never expected from her. Some relatives struggled visibly, uncomfortable and unsure how to react, but nobody said anything cruel in that moment. My grandmother, weak but lucid, reached for my hand and then Sophie's, holding both without asking a single question. "Love is love," she whispered, voice barely audible. "I just want to see you happy before I go." Her words broke something open in the entire room, softening even the most hesitant relatives into quiet, tearful acceptance. My grandmother stabilized over the following days, doctors cautiously optimistic, allowing our family gathering to shift from crisis into relief. That week in Ohio, something fundamental changed, not just in my family's understanding, but in how openly Sophie and I existed together. We returned to Portland lighter somehow, carrying less fear. Though the shop's financial troubles still waited for us at home, Sophie sat me down one evening, finally sharing the full picture. Numbers spread across the kitchen table between us. The shop needed a significant investment within 30 days or risked losing the lease permanently to a new tenant. I offered my savings without hesitation, but Sophie hesitated, afraid of blending our finances too quickly, too soon. "This isn't charity," I told her. "This is us building something together, the way partners are supposed to." She finally agreed, tears in her eyes, admitting she'd never let anyone share this kind of weight with her before. We combined our savings, negotiated with the landlord, and secured just enough to keep Moonleaf Tea open through the next quarter. David, her old friend, offered to help redesign the shop's branding, and slowly the three of us became an unlikely team. Business improved steadily, word spreading through the neighborhood about the two women who'd fought to keep their shop alive together. For the first time, Sophie introduced me to new customers not as her friend or partner, but simply as my girlfriend. Hearing her say it so easily, without flinching, felt like watching a door finally swing wide open after years shut tight. Just when things felt steady, an old face walked into the shop. Someone from Sophie's past she clearly hadn't expected. "Sophie," the woman said. "Done." And I watched Sophie's whole body stiffen at the sound of that single word. Her name was Claire, an ex-girlfriend from years before I'd ever entered the picture. Standing awkwardly by the door, Sophie introduced us politely, but tension crackled in the air, thick enough that even customers seemed to notice something was wrong. That night, Sophie explained that Claire had been her first serious relationship, one that ended badly after Claire chose to stay closeted permanently. "She broke my heart," Sophie admitted, "and I never fully told you how much that shaped how I love people." I understood then why she'd hidden the loan, why she'd hidden David's photo, why honesty felt so dangerous to her. Claire began returning to the shop occasionally, and I noticed Sophie growing quiet and distant every time she appeared. Insecurity crept into my thoughts, wondering if old feelings still lingered somewhere beneath Sophie's careful, controlled composure. One evening I finally asked directly, unwilling to let assumptions quietly poison what we'd worked so hard to build. "Do you still have feelings for her?" asked, voice steady despite the fear tightening in my chest. Sophie looked genuinely startled, then took my hands firmly, saying, "No. She reminds me who I used to be, not who I want." "I was scared of becoming that person again," she admitted. "Someone who hides love out of fear of losing everything." Her honesty, raw and unguarded, dissolved most of my doubt, replacing it with a deeper understanding of her past wounds. Claire eventually stopped visiting after realizing Sophie had moved forward completely, choosing a life she once believed impossible. That closure, though quiet, gave Sophie a kind of peace I hadn't seen in her before, lighter in her shoulders. We used that turning point to talk more openly, promising never again to let fear silently rebuild walls between us. Slowly, trust deepened further, built not on perfection, but on repeated choices to stay honest through discomfort. I began to believe, cautiously, that we had survived the hardest parts, that smoother days were finally ahead of us. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, everything shifted in a direction neither of us saw coming at all. Sophie received a call from a Seattle-based tea company, offering to buy exclusive rights to her signature brown sugar recipe. The offer included a generous licensing deal, but required relocating operations, potentially closing the original Portland shop entirely. Sophie sat frozen after the call, torn between financial security and losing the physical space where our story had begun. "This shop is where I met you," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can let that go." I reminded her that our relationship didn't live inside four walls, that love could survive change if we chose it deliberately. Though the decision weighed heavily, especially with David and her small staff depending on the shop for their livelihood. We spent nights weighing pros and cons, spreadsheets and emotions tangled together in ways that felt impossible to separate cleanly. Finally, Sophie proposed a compromise, licensing the recipe for extra income while keeping the original Portland shop open permanently. The Seattle company agreed. Surprisingly flexible, allowing Sophie to retain ownership of Moonleaf Tea while gaining financial breathing room. The deal closed within 2 weeks, finally clearing the remaining debt and securing the shop's future for years to come. Celebrating that night, Sophie pulled me close and said, "None of this happens without you believing in me first." I realized then how far we'd both come. From strangers with a remembered order to partners who'd rebuilt each other's lives. My mother visited again that autumn, this time bringing homemade dishes, sitting comfortably at Sophie's kitchen table without hesitation. Watching them laugh together over dinner, I felt something settle permanently inside me, a peace I hadn't dared hope for. Sophie's parents, slowly and imperfectly, began asking about me too. Small questions that signaled a door cautiously opening. We didn't rush their process. Understanding acceptance often arrives gradually, built through patience rather than forced through confrontation. One quiet evening, Sophie handed me a small notebook, the very one where she'd first written down my order. Inside, new pages had been added, filled with memories, inside jokes, and small observations collected over our entire relationship. On the final page, she'd written a question instead of a memory, asking simply if I would build a life with her. I looked up. Done. Finding her kneeling by the window seat where we'd first really talked, ring box open in her hand. "You remembered my order the very first day," I said, laughing through tears. "Of course I'll remember this one too." "Yes," I whispered, pulling her into my arms, both of us crying and laughing in the middle of the empty shop. We got married the following spring, in a small garden ceremony, surrounded by family who had learned to choose love over fear. Standing there, I realized the bravest thing I ever did was let a stranger's remembered order become the beginning of everything. Some love stories start with fireworks. Ours started with brown sugar oat milk and a woman who chose to remember me. Years later, our own shop bears both our names above the door, proof that being seen, truly seen, can change a life. Fendi.